Good morning. This morning we are in Ecclesiastes chapter 2. So, I thought about maybe interrupting our Ecclesiastes readings for maybe a short Mother's Day message, although, I tend not to interrupt the flow of things for secular holidays. Then it occurred to me that I think as Solomon has been talking about futility and frustration, I thought that's a perfect Mother's Day message. Mothers everywhere understand that. So let's read Ecclesiastes chapter 2. We'll begin in verse 12. So I turned to consider wisdom and madness and folly. For what can the man do who comes after the king? Only what has already been done. Then I saw that there is more gain in wisdom than in folly, as there is more gain in light than in darkness. The wise person has his eyes in his head, but the fool walks around in darkness. And yet I perceived that the same event happens to all of them. Then I said in my heart, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. Why then have I been so very wise? And I said in my heart that this also is vanity. For of the wise as of the fool there is no enduring remembrance, seeing that in the days to come all will have been long forgotten. How the wise dies just like the fool. So I hated life, because what is done under the sun was grievous to me. For all is vanity and a striving after wind. The King Solomon has been considering the futility of life in and of itself. Just life taken by itself, nothing outside of itself. And he's considered the way that nature works. He's considered the pleasures of life. He's considered how all of these things are ultimately pointless. They don't arrive anywhere. They're just in a constant state of going somewhere. And they're ultimately meaningless. And so now he turns his attention to something that might surprise us. I mean, it won't surprise us that he turns his attention to it, but his conclusions about it might surprise us. He says, I turned to consider wisdom and madness and folly. And out of all people, we would expect the great King Solomon surely will say that there is meaning and lasting worth in wisdom, right? I mean, of all people, Solomon's got to find something good in wisdom. And he says that there is some benefit. There is something in wisdom, in and of itself, that's good. Wisdom, there's more gain in wisdom than in folly, as there's more gain in light than in darkness. So at least the wise person has his eyes in his head, whereas the fool is wandering around in darkness. But there is no lasting value in wisdom to recommend it over folly. Right? It's better in the moment to be wise than to be a fool. But in the long run, there is nothing to recommend wisdom over folly. As Solomon says, the same thing happens to the wise that happens to the fool. Now, he runs up against the same problem that he's been running up against and that he'll continue to run up against, which is death. A wise man dies just as well as the fool does, and given long enough, the wise man will be forgotten, just as the fool is forgotten. Wisdom by itself offers nothing permanent. Now, that might shock us to hear Solomon give that estimation of wisdom. You get the sense it kind of shocks him too. It upsets him at least. I hated life, he says, because what is done under the sun was grievous to me. For all is vanity and a striving after wind. You can hear Solomon's pain in realizing that there is nothing of permanent value in wisdom. You can see what a frustrating thing it was for him. In fact, if we read on, he lets this frustration run out a little bit. Go to verse 18. I hated all my toil in which I toil under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be wise or a fool. He hates life. He hates everything that he's done. In talking about lasting value, right, we've not yet said anything about the first thing which would come to the typical ancient Near Eastern mind. Right, if you're wanting to talk about permanence, lasting worth, if you're wanting to talk about that in the ancient Near East, what you're going to be talking about is heirs. Right, the people who come after you. We've seen it, especially in the law of Moses. It's all over the law of Moses. The sons of Israel cared a lot about passing their names and their inheritance down through the ages, through their sons. In fact, that's the way that God presents the promise to them. It's going to be an inheritance for them and for their sons forever. Right? And that's the first way that God reveals his eternal purpose and the promise of eternal life to us is through that system of inheritance. Again, it begins as a crude worldly understanding. But he approaches Israel where they are. They're very concerned about passing their names and their inheritance down through their sons. And that preoccupation is even reflected in the very name, what they called themselves, the sons of Israel. They were descended from Israel, and their sons would be descended from the man Israel as well. And so long as they carried on that descent, they carried the promise of God along with them. To the ancient mind, you cannot seriously talk about lasting value without talking about posterity. It's not just got to last long enough for me, it's got to last long enough not just for my kids, my grandkids, it's got to last for all of the kids that will ever come after me to the end of time. All right? That's something that lasts. And so King Solomon takes the one thing that we would most expect to be of lasting worth, which is wisdom, and he judges it according to the highest ancient standard of worth, which is posterity. And he still finds it lacking. All right, I hated all my toil in which I toil under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to the man who will come after me. That's normally a positive sentiment in the Bible. Here, obviously, is negative. Who knows whether he will be wise or a fool? Yet he will be master of all for which I have toiled and used my wisdom under the sun. This also is vanity. So I turned about and gave my heart up to despair over the toil of my labors under the sun. Because sometimes a person who has toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill must leave everything to be enjoyed by someone who did not toil for it. This also is vanity and a great evil. What has a man from all the toil and striving of heart with which he toils beneath the sun? For his days are full of sorrow, his work is a vexation. Even in the night his heart does not rest. This also is vanity. There's nothing better for a person that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God. For apart from him, who can eat or who can have enjoyment? For the one who pleases him, God is given wisdom and knowledge and joy. But to the sinner, he is given the business of gathering and collecting only to give to the one who pleases God. This also is vanity and striving after wind. All right, so he considers wisdom in light of posterity. And he says there's no guarantees there. In fact, there's less guarantee in wisdom than there is just in a house. Right? In the plot of land that you've been given by God. Right? That land, that's going to be there. I can pass that down to my son. It doesn't matter if he's as dumb as a box of tacks. The land is still there. And he can pass it on to his son. And it's still going to be there. But what I produce from my wisdom, that can go out just like that. If my son's a moron, if he's a fool, the product of my wisdom is not going to last beyond me, he says. And he says, who knows whether he will be wise or a fool? Again, I think this is another good Mother's Day message. We do what we can, right, as mothers and fathers. But we understand there is only so much that we can do, and the rest we have to pray for. Right? Holly and I work just about as hard as we can to make sure that our children are not fools. And yet, if I'm being as honest as Solomon, I have to say to myself, who knows how these two will turn out? Again, we're doing our part. But there's a lot of stuff there that we just have to pray for. And Solomon says this is when you're trying to assign meaning and importance and value to things, when you're trying to find something to hang your hat on, wisdom, it doesn't fit the bill. Spend all this time working, all this time trying to create a legacy for posterity, and it's just gone. I don't get to enjoy it. The person after me might not get to enjoy it if he fritters it away. And so he comes to the same conclusion that he had reached at the beginning of the text. Right? He says wisdom is good in the moment. Right? It's better to live your life wise than a fool, because at least you got your eyes in your head. And he comes to that same conclusion again, that really the only good thing to find out of anything can only be found in the moment. Which is why he says there's nothing better for a person than he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. Right? There's no sense in pretending like these transitory things that provide no lasting worth, like they're somehow going to provide lasting worth if we work harder and make ourselves more miserable over them. Right? They're only valuable in the moment. And so Solomon says, if that's the only value you're going to get out of them, then you might as well enjoy them in the moment. Or else it's either that or zero value. Take your pick. Be miserable or at least enjoy what you have. And so the whole thing is lacking. And then Solomon goes even a step further. He turns the whole enterprise of wisdom on its head. He turns on wisdom altogether. Remember that the point of wisdom is to direct people to the good life. And Solomon has already said that over the course of this reading. When you're wise, you got your eyes in your head. When you're a fool, you're walking in the darkness. God has given good things to those who are wise and knowledgeable. But to the sinner, he has given the business of gathering and collecting only to give to the one who pleases God. So it's good. The point of wisdom is to direct people to the good life. Many of the instructions that we read in the Proverbs, for example, are about reaching good outcomes or avoiding bad outcomes. Very practical stuff. Wisdom is the earliest form of science. Right? Trying to make some kind of exploration and discovery of the world around us so that we can put it to good use and lead a good life. Because ultimately, that's what wisdom and science are about. Ultimately, it is about some form of control when it comes down to it, avoiding bad outcomes ensuring good outcomes. Right? It starts with discovery, but it all arrives at a point. And so let us see what Solomon says about outcomes and how much effect wisdom has on controlling outcomes. Chapter 3, verse 1. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to break down and a time to build up. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to seek and a time to lose. A time to keep and a time to cast away. A time to tear and a time to sow. A time to keep silence and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate. A time for war and a time for peace. What gain has the worker from his toil? I've seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. He's made everything beautiful in its time. Also, He's put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. I perceive that there is nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also, that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. For I perceived that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken away from it. God has done it so that people fear before Him. That which is already has been, that which is to be already has been, and God seeks what has been driven away. There is no amount of wisdom that can stave off loss, destruction, war, death, and mourning forever. There's a time for all of those things, and they will come in their times, regardless of how wise we think we are. There's no human wisdom that can stave those things off. There is a time for everything according to God's will, and that will we are largely blind to. Right? We're aware of what we have in the moment. God has made everything beautiful in its time. We are aware of eternity. God has put it in our hearts. But we cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. The movement of time is outside of our control. A lot of these things that happen, as far as our human wisdom is concerned, are largely arbitrary. Time to be born, a time to die. Time to plant, time to pluck up what is to be planted. Things just happen. Any control that we have over these things, any kind of wisdom or skill that we apply to them is largely illusory. And so again, Solomon keeps coming back to the same thing he's been saying. I perceive there's nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. In other words, all of this stuff, any attempt to control, again, has no lasting value. And so you might as well enjoy what you have while you have it. While we are aware of eternity and aware of God's will, we don't know exactly what He is going to do and what He has in store. And so he finishes up. We're going to read one more passage. He finishes up by bringing us to a conclusion that, again, you would not expect to hear out of the mouth of the man who wrote the Proverbs. What does Solomon ultimately think about wisdom when it comes down to it? Here's what he thinks. We're going to start in chapter 3, verse 16, and finish the chapter. Moreover, I saw under the sun that in the place of justice even there was wickedness. In the place of righteousness, even there was wickedness. All right, wisdom hasn't fixed that. I said in my heart, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every matter and for every work. I said in my heart with regard to the children of man, that God is testing them, that they may see that they themselves are but beasts. For what happens to the children of man and what happens to the beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath. Man has no advantage over the beasts, for all is vanity. All go to one place, all are from the dust, and to dust all return. Who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward or the spirit of the beast goes down into the earth? So I saw that there is nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his work, for that is his lot. Who can bring him to see what will be after him? And the situation is so dismal that wisdom by itself, just wisdom in and of itself with nothing outside of it, not only does wisdom not separate you from the fool in the long run, it doesn't even separate you from the beasts in the long run. And again, it all comes down to the same thing, the problem of death. It says if you are trying to find meaning and purpose in wisdom, you need to face up to the fact that you are no better than an animal. You're going to die like there's a lot of dumb animals in this world. Y'all seen animals do stupid stuff, right? It's hilarious when it happens. I love watching animals do stupid stuff. I grew up raising cows, so I got a lot of entertainment because they are really dumb. And I like to think of myself as maybe a little better off than a cow. And yet, if I was trying to hang my hat on my own intellect and my own wisdom, my own reason, then ultimately I'm no better than a cow. Solomon says that there is something else that we need to point to. So as we do every Sunday, we proclaim that something else. That God's eternal purpose, that the meaning that God has for our lives has been expressed and fulfilled in His Son, Jesus of Nazareth. We invite you to obey the good news of Jesus Christ. Believe that He is the Son of God who came and gave Himself for your sins. Turn away from the life of sin. Confess Jesus as Lord. Be baptized into His death, burial, and resurrection for the remission of your sins. And live knowing that in Him and in Him alone we have purpose and meaning and something of lasting worth. If you're subject to the invitation, won't you come as together we stand and sing?